Good evening and welcome to the Florida Academy of Family Physicians' third installment of COVID-19 webinars designed to help family physicians and their staff in dealing with the coronavirus crisis. My name is Jay Milson, FAFP Executive Vice President, and I will once again have the pleasure of moderating tonight's program. What is that program? It's addressing stress management and navigating legal implications. And it'll provide insight from our two presenters who will focus on how best to stay calm amongst the chaos and help answer questions you may be struggling with in practicing during the pandemic. Similar to last week's webinar, participants will be in listen-only mode, but can type questions that our panelists can see and will attempt to answer either during or at the end of the presentation. Stay tuned for more information at the end of the program and throughout next week regarding our program for Thursday, April 16th, 1 week from tonight at 8 p.m., an evidence-based primer about COVID-19 for family physicians. Scheduled to be presented by FAFP past president, Dr. Dan Van Dermee. All right, let's get started. As I introduce our first speaker, I'm reminded of something I don't think any of us have really heard for a while. Remember the speech when flight attendants, when they give it prior to taking off, it's like, in the unlikely event of a decrease in the plane's cabin pressure and your air masks are deployed, make certain you fix your own mask prior to assisting others. While this seems kind of logical, far too often we see our physicians so focused on their patients, they forget to take care of themselves. Well, I can only imagine that this is even more of an acute situation as it relates to physician wellness during COVID crisis. With this in mind, I'd like to introduce our first speaker who's going to, I think she's going to help us breathe a little bit easier. Dr. Sanchez Wohlever, Amaryllis Sanchez Wohlever, is a board-certified family physician from Orlando and an expert in the area of physician burnout, wellness, and resiliency. She's authored several books and speaks around the country on the subject in her quest to help physicians cope with stress. Welcome, Dr. Sanchez Wohlever.
Thank you so much, Jay. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. It's always a tremendous honor to be able to speak to my colleagues. And so thank you so much to the FAFP, not only for inviting me, but for even thinking about this very critical topic right now and holding this webinar. And if you can advance to the first slide, I would like to start by saying thank you to every physician out there, and in particular, our family physicians here in Florida who have basically overnight transformed their practices, completely changed what they do. I was blessed to participate on the FAFP webinar last week by several physician leaders from the FAFP, and it was incredibly impressive to hear what they've all done practically overnight. We are all doing different things, and I'm very aware of that. We may practice in very different settings, especially as family physicians. Some of us are doing more than 90% telemedicine right now. Some are in urgent care centers, ERs, outpatient, inpatient, even intensive care units. So we have different stressors, but we all need exactly what Jay Milson just said right now. We all need to take care of ourselves first so that we can take care of others. So I'm glad you're here. And if I could have the next slide. Jay already said a little bit about me, but I am a wife. I am married to a pastor. We have 3 children. We live in Orlando, and I've been a family physician for 25 years. I am a certified coach for physicians, having gone through my own story with near burnout and really experiencing the impact of the moral and ethical distress that many of us are acquainted with corporate medicine. And so my area is now physician wellness, burnout prevention, leadership, and advocacy. And I mention this because my advocacy has brought me all the way from the exam room to the Capitol. And I was at the Florida Capitol the week before this really started in Florida. So I was doctor of the day at the legislative clinic. And that meant I was in touch with my senator. And so I was able to stay in touch with the senator here locally and deal with some issues regarding PPE, and regarding some local needs of our doctors. And so it is so important during this time for us to be advocates for our needs, and we'll talk about that. I have 2 images on this slide. The first one is my favorite photograph of myself, and it's because it took place during a medical mission. I've done some missions to Guatemala. And I have that on here because basically the flexibility and the creativity and innovation, the teamwork, the leadership, and the ability to be very present in the moment is what helps us do well when we do medical missions overseas. But it's also the same mindset and traits that will really help us now during this crisis. And so I thought mission medicine is basically what we're doing. The second picture is me when I was in the Air Force. I was a military physician straight out of residency. And this will lead me right into our thoughts about the coronavirus. When I was in the military, I was chair of infection control for my base, and they named me the HIV designated physician for the base. And when this happened, this was very early in the days of HIV. And so they sent me off to an excellent, very thorough training for 2 weeks in another state. And when I returned, I actually, that same week, I had my very first HIV positive patient that I treated. And so I was completely equipped for what was coming. I felt amazing because I knew exactly what to do. I had all the resources I needed. And we like that, right? As doctors, we went to medical school because we want to be excellent and do a great job with each patient. Well, that is not what we've had here, right? With COVID-19, it's been very different. We were not prepared, and doctors don't like that. We don't do very well sometimes in those settings, although I'm impressed with how well we have done. But our top predictor for physician burnout is our inability to do an excellent job. And the reality is that this pandemic began with 40 to 60% of doctors already burned out or morally injured or distrusting. And so on top of that, with the country not being prepared, with the situation with PPE being in shortage, really not enough testing to keep us safe, which is so foundational, and a slow flow of evidence-based information with no treatment, no vaccine, limited studies or data. Now, this is rapidly improving now, which gives me hope, but I'm just trying to paint a picture for all of us. That this is the context in which we enter into this pandemic, and it's a setup for trouble for both the healthcare system and us. And so it's brought out into the open some of the brokenness and the failures of the system, but it's also brought out the innovative spirit, the creativity and flexibility of physicians, and I'm very reassured by this. But it's essential to address our stressors and our stress, the emotional state we were in going into the pandemic, and the emotional impact the lack of preparedness is having on us already. So thank you to the FAFP for addressing this. I believe this is a marathon, not a sprint. And as leaders of the healthcare team, we will need more support than ever. So how do we stay positive and resilient? Where do we start? If we could move to the next slide, we start at the basics. We cannot neglect what's most important. I know you've all seen this slide right here, which is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have all studied it. It's a reminder that our physiological needs are foundational. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I just wanted to give you this visual as a reminder. After the basics, safety is next. Personal security, resources, health, property. There's a reason things like OSHA exist. These are well-established basic human needs we all have. Next slide, please. So the basics are the same. During a pandemic, the basics have not changed. And so if we look at the three images on top, we have someone, well, a dog sleeping. We have somebody exercising in a pool, and we have a picture of some very healthy options for our nutrition. And so the first thing I've been hearing from physicians is that they're having trouble sleeping. And of course, this makes a lot of sense. Many of our colleagues are having issues with this. And it's basically because cortisol is at work. This is the stress hormone. And so a few tips that will help with this. The first thing is to avoid watching the news all the time throughout the day, to avoid social media, especially close to bedtime, and basically to put our phones down. I think we need to have really good boundaries around that. Also, exercise will help a lot, but not right before bed. So we want to do that earlier in the day. Closer to bedtime, we want to, we know these are reminders. Things like stretching would be better than, going out for a run. Things like yoga or meditation, certainly prayer, listening to gentle music, reading something that is not medical, that is inspiring, that is light reading. And if you've seen The Office and you know who used to play Jim, John Krasinski, he has a new YouTube show called SGN, which is Some Good News. And so I would urge us all to be filling our minds with good things in the midst of this scary time. If you have small children, reading them a book, or let them read to you, just finding ways to keep it light. But again, our basic needs have not changed. We need to be outside. We need oxygen. We need clean air. We need to spend time with the people we love. And we also need reasonable numbers of shifts and hours at work. And we certainly need to take breaks. And so for all these, we will need to advocate for ourselves. But we are mind, body, soul, spirit. So we need to take care of all of it. A good mantra for this time would be take care of yourself, take care of others, and connect in meaningful ways. And with that, let's go to the next slide, where we're going to talk about the other foundational issue that we've had. Safety is primary. In the workplace right now, taking care of yourself begins with adequate personal protective equipment. I call this the crisis within the crisis. Safety is essential. If we don't feel safe at our workplace, this has to be dealt with, period. So you've likely heard about the ER physician, Dr. Ming Lin, out on the West Coast, and others who have been fired or threatened with job loss for standing up for their safety, standing up for their patients and their teams. Again, this brings to light the brokenness and the disconnect between doctors and decision makers in some settings, not all. I am very proud of all the medical organizations that are speaking up about all these. This includes the AMA, the ACGME, the ACMS, and a multitude. Well, the ACMS includes basically all the medical specialties, have come up with very strong statements addressing physicians' rights to a safe workplace, to wearing their own PPE if what they have been given does not appear adequate for them, and having a right to speak up for themselves and for their teams. If we go to the next slide, what we do know is that not everybody has handled this very well, right? And so this says physician wellness in a pandemic. You are the physician leader. You are the expert. And so it is a time for us to be who we are. We are the ones who know epidemiology. We know infection control. I urge you to be sure that you have what you need to care for people safely and well. This will be an antidote to burnout right there. If someone wants you to be sloppy, they are the one with the problem, not you. You need to speak up. And I know in some corporate settings, it may be wise actually and more effective to get a group of physicians together and address your medical director or your CEO or whoever is the decision maker in the group. But go together, come to agreement as physicians, choose a spokesperson, and then advocate for your needs and your patients' needs that way. The bottom line is you need to be able to trust your organization and your leadership. So we need to speak up and be who we are, even if it's uncomfortable. So I think that's more important than ever. It's not a good time to be passive or to acquiesce. My hope is this will actually embolden us again as physician leaders throughout the country. If we could see the next slide, I'm going to transition into the fact that we really do need to be human first, and I'm just going to go into a little more detail with each of these. What I recommend is a whole person approach to yourself. And so the first thing on the slide is physical safety, exercise, nutrition, and rest. And it all falls right here. Like we talked about, safety is first, but beyond that, exercise, nutrition, and enough rest are essential to have a strong immune system. So it will even help us be less vulnerable to getting infected with the virus. Emotional and mental health often go together. Our emotional state impacts our thinking and vice versa. And some actions and mindsets that may help in that regard would again start with turning off or minimizing the news. I think we should, listen and watch and read enough to stay informed, but not be overwhelmed or obsessed with what's happening. Also, things like keeping a gratitude journal to count your blessings daily, especially if you start your day with a practice like that and you end your day with a practice like that. It can take a minute. It can take 30 seconds, but it can be very, very helpful for us to stay positive by focusing on the good. Also, checking in with someone who cares about you at least once a day, and ideally more. If you have a therapist, a friend you know, a chaplain, a pastor. It could be your spouse, a parent, a friend, a colleague you trust. Stay connected with them and check in very often. The point would be to address any fearful thoughts and disarm them as much as possible, and get help if needed, but don't wait until you need it. What we want to do is prevent it and be thinking ahead that we need to take care of ourselves in mind, body, soul, and spirit. I've heard some businesses during these crises are offering 20 counseling or coaching sessions per year for their employees, and this is not even medical businesses. So surely our hospitals are offering these things too. And in fact, in Florida, many different counties, even before this crisis began, were already offering things like that. So do look into your areas and see what's available. Remind yourself this is temporary. I think it's very helpful to live one day at a time and one moment at a time. And remember that stress raises cortisol levels. It's not great for immunity, so let's minimize that. As far as our spiritual health, again, being intentional with what you read, what you watch, what you hear, reading wholesome and inspiring books, listening to podcasts, things that help you not just be focused on the crisis. Being intentional also about finding meaning in suffering can really completely transform the experience for us. What I'm doing is I'm holding Zoom meetups for physicians, and we've had that already. And it's a tremendous opportunity to vent, to share with your colleagues, to reframe our experiences, and to help each other stay positive and hopeful. And it's very helpful because we know what we're each going through being doctors. And so reach out if you're interested, or start your own wherever you are. These are very, very helpful right now. And then I wanted to touch on the importance of grieving. Grief is something that we're all experiencing. We've all had losses already of one type or another. Certainly this physical distancing is affecting all of us. And so allow time as well as space to grieve, to express your emotions, to voice your anxiety and fears in a safe place. This often goes unaddressed in medicine, and it needs to be addressed. So again, get help if needed, but especially prevent it. So stay close to those who can help, stay close to your loved ones, stay close to your teams at work. I was really very pleased to hear from our speakers last week how much working as a team helped them transition to the way they're practicing medicine now in the crisis, and how much it has helped them come together as people. And that has been an antidote to burnout as well. So pay attention to one another, take care of one another, help each other. I think humor is also helpful. So if you have children like I do, they help with that. And again, remember how much exercise helps everything. It helps the mind, it helps the body, it helps the spirit. So as much as you can get out and just be physical right now, it will really help. If we could go to the next slide, please. I think it's really helpful also to have a routine as you transition home from work. Right now, it's critical. Certainly in relation to infection control, it is critical. And I know a lot of doctors who have a whole routine where they're going in through their garage, they leave their shoes in the garage, they change their clothes, they throw them in the wash, they go in, they shower, and then they come out and they hug the family. And they have set expectations so that the children understand in an age-appropriate way why this has to happen. And I think setting those expectations in the family really helps. But I think it's also important to have a plan to transition emotionally and spiritually from whatever stressors you're having at work to then transitioning to being home in a completely different role. I think if you don't take time intentionally to have a routine that helps you transition that way, it can really set a foundation where this is hard, and then you're just not getting what you need at home, and neither is your family. So this is very important. If we could, but important to not neglect what's most important we've talked about, and also just don't isolate, stay connected with people. And if we could go to the next slide. I wrote a poem last week, and some of you may be able to read it here, but it will be available later as well. But I just wanted to mention just a few things from it. The first one is under the A that spells pandemic. I wrote, avoid substances as a coping strategy, and instead reach out to someone. And whether it is alcohol, or other substances. Even caffeine can really impact you in a negative way by, going from causing or worsening anxiety to affecting your sleep, causing palpitations, and having other physical symptoms. So just really think very carefully about that. In fact, it's actually a great time to quit smoking for those who do. And I've heard of a few people who just went cold turkey and are no longer smoking, and I love that. I also wrote under the E, eat to nurture your body and soul, and then I wrote chocolate allowed. So it's a reminder that treats are great right now, especially with families home and just not going outdoors as much or outside as much. And so any kind of treats or board game nights or movie nights, whatever you can come up with, and especially if you can rotate in the family and ask different people what they want so that everybody's needs are met, that can really help. Under the I wrote incorporate silence as well as solitude. And so again here, journaling can be very helpful, and just taking time for reflection, which can help us discern greater meaning in the suffering that people are experiencing and that we ourselves might be experiencing as well. And finally, I mentioned let people take care of you. I think we tend as doctors to not be great at that. And so I really urge all of us to let other people take care of us. If we stay connected to one another, if we remember the why of what we do, and we reach up to the heavens with faith for strength and hope, we will all get through this time. And I actually think that we might be much more resilient, and we may have just transformed medicine in many of the ways that are needed by the way that we have handled this time. If we could just see the next slide. So I want to just thank you all again. And when I thank you, I just want you to really pause. I really want you to receive that, because you are essential. You are valued. You are appreciated. Your patients, your community are grateful for what you do. I'm grateful for what you do. The FAFP is grateful. Please take care of yourself. Wear your PPE every time, no exceptions. And if I could have the last slide, this is my contact information. It says reach out anytime, and I mean that sincerely. Please take care of yourself, and thank you again. I hope you found that helpful.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sanchez Wohlever. We appreciate it. Next, we're going to move on to Christopher Nuland. He is a person, you really don't want to have to speak to, but once you do, you quickly realize you're glad you do. You did, because of the things that he normally has to say. Chris is a Jacksonville-based healthcare attorney who I've had the pleasure of working with directly and indirectly the past 27 years within organized medicine. When I started with the Florida Medical Association in 1993, Chris Nuland was the Associate General Counsel there, and has certainly advanced his career and opened a healthcare law practice that has been extremely successful and lobbies for a number of different organized medicine medical societies throughout the state. Chris is going to discuss several key areas of importance for family physicians as it relates to practicing in the new COVID-19 era. Furthermore, he will attempt to answer any questions you may have but aren't covered during the presentation. Chris, welcome.
Thank you, Jay. And just as Doctor said, thank you to everyone who's on this call. You guys are doing God's work out there in the field, putting yourselves on the line each and every day. Before we get going, I just want to give you the latest update from 6:30 this afternoon from the Department of Health, stating that there right now just about 17,000 cases in the state of Florida. That's up about 1,100 from this time yesterday. The good news is that over the last 5 days, there's been a trend towards the slope decreasing. Now we're still going up, and the number of average cases per day continues to rise, but at a much slower level than it was even a week ago. So we're very hopeful that we are starting to get towards that first hump. We were talking before we came on that when all of this is over, there will very likely be a second hump as people go back and don't do the social distancing that they're doing right now. But I thought it'd be good just to let people know where we are right now. We're going to start this afternoon by talking about Executive Order 2072. This is the one that directly impacts physicians probably the most. And the question I get most often is, what can I do? The good news is that as a family physician, you're allowed to do just about everything you need to do. Throughout the state, physician offices are considered essential services. That's great for you if you want to see patients. And we understand that some of you may not want to see routine patients. You are allowed to conduct typical E&M visits that are so much the bread and butter of what a family physician does. You are allowed to perform any procedure or surgery that will address any serious or life-threatening condition which, if left untreated, will worsen during the term of the executive order. That one takes a little bit more discussion, because I know some of you may want to take off a mole, a suspicious mole. Can you do that? In dermatological stuff, you've got an AK versus a squamous cell. What we've been told at the Board of Medicine is that if you're going to do any type of procedure, you have to document the heck out of it to show that the condition was serious, and that if you left it alone, it would be worse by the end of the executive order. That executive order right now goes through May 8th, and Governor DeSantis has yet to extend it. So we're kind of hoping that in the next 2 weeks, we see that curve peaking and coming down, and that we can get everybody fully back to work. You're also allowed to provide and prescribe controlled substances for existing patients without an in-person visit. We're going to talk a lot about telemedicine over the next few minutes. You are not allowed to prescribe controlled substances for new patients via telemedicine. But this is one of the ways in which the administration, both in Washington and in Tallahassee, are trying to make life a little bit easier. Some of the examples that we're coming in is a cancer excision. And again, you may not want to do that. That may be something you put out to somebody else. But an infection is something that you may see. Somebody comes in with what looks like an infection. If that goes untreated, and you may have to debride it, it could get worse. And that's the kind of stuff that they are intentionally allowing physicians to do. Can I go to the next slide, please? What can I not do? And that goes to any medically unnecessary, non-urgent, or non-emergency procedure or surgery which, if delayed, does not place a patient's immediate health, safety, or welfare at risk. Examples that we're using include diagnostic colonoscopies, cosmetic procedures. There's no way that anybody should be giving cosmetic fillers at this point. In the Board of Medicine, I can tell you that the chairman is especially alert to this, because they figure that if a doctor is willing to threaten, or not threaten, but to risk a patient's health in order to do something completely cosmetic, that they're the type of physician that Florida does not need. Non-urgent spine and orthopedic surgeries, most of those have been canceled. As you know, most of your orthopedic colleagues are doing very little work these days. The colonoscopy, to me, is important to look at because it shows the difference between what you can and cannot do. If you have a patient, for instance, who has a new unexplained abdominal pain that is severe, yes, you can do a diagnostic colonoscopy in that case, because you're worried that they may have a condition that if you don't treat it could get worse. But if you're seeing a patient who is just 50 years old and they're getting their first 50+ colonoscopy, those have got to wait until the emergency is over. Next slide, please. When will it end? Nobody knows. The executive order, as we mentioned, is set to expire on May 8th, 2020, but it may be extended by Governor DeSantis. At this moment, though, he has not indicated that he wants to do that. So everybody is really looking at May 8th as the target date for when something is going to be said. That'll be 60 days since a state of emergency was first declared in Florida. And by then, again, we hope to see that we are on the downward slope when it comes to new cases. May 8th may, however, if the statistical models are right, we will still be near the spike and the peak of when people are dying as a result of this, because the basic rule is that it takes 10 days from somebody to go from a reported case to, unfortunately, a death, just the way that this disease processes. Next slide, please. After 2072, the governor issued another proclamation. This is Executive Order 20-91, what he calls his Safer at Home. Understand, physician offices are essential services, but there is not a mandate that you keep your office open. I know what a lot of family practices are doing right now is they are getting rid operationally of their waiting room. You will come in, you will text or call the front office that will get the number, and when the physician, nurse is ready to see you, they will text you to come in, bypass the waiting room, go directly into the examination room, have the examination, any prescriptions will be mentioned there, and then send the person out. Again, while you are open for business, safe distancing is absolutely incredibly important at this time. We don't want to endanger our patients. We don't want to endanger you. Minimize the use of PPE if medically prudent. I know you're seeing a lot of patients. I encourage you to use all medically appropriate PPE. When I say minimize the use, one of the ways I had talked about that even before the governor instituted his ban on elective procedures is don't do the elective Botox and stuff like that, because it uses surgical gloves that could best be used elsewhere. The fact that we say here, minimize use of the PPE, again, only if it is medically prudent to do so. We want you to protect yourselves throughout this. Next slide, please. One of the ways that a lot of people are coping right now is an expanded use of telemedicine. And the reason we're doing that is A, you can do it without endangering yourself or your patients. And the Trump administration early on made telehealth much easier. What they said was they would not enforce HIPAA regulations when it came to telemedicine. What that means is while before this crisis occurred and after this crisis goes away, you're going to have to make sure that all of your telehealth platforms are secure. You do not have that requirement right now. So if you want to go to Zoom, if you want to use Duo or something like that, you can right now. Remember, though, that Florida has an explicit definition of telehealth. In order to qualify as telehealth, the term does not include audio-only telephone calls, email messages, or facsimile transmissions. How do you reconcile those two? Well, let's go to the next slide and find out. The rule of thumb that I'm using with my doctors is that you must use both your eyes and ears during any type of telehealth collaboration with your patient. What does that mean? Ideally, you're going to have the patient in front of you on Zoom or some sort of platform in which you're looking at the patient as well as talking to them. But that may not be always available if you can get other information. For instance, they go into a telehealth spot that gives you their blood pressure, their pulse, things like that, and you're looking over data that can qualify as telehealth. One of the things that's also out there right now, even though telehealth in Florida requires both eyes and ears, Medicare last week came up with a new rule that an audio-only telephone conversation can be billed to Medicare. It does not get billed as a telehealth visit, but you can bill for telephone calls. It is incredibly low amount right now, but it gives you something. One of the things that we worked very, very hard for in Tallahassee, and I give all sorts of kudos to my colleagues in the specialty societies and to the FMA is trying to make sure that at least for the duration of the crisis, that there's payment equity from Medicare and most payers when it comes to telemedicine, and we were successful. Most of the major payers and Medicare have all said they will pay for telehealth until April 30th at in-person rates. It's all designed to encourage people to use telemedicine, and we will continue to do so as much as we can. Remember, though, that if it's telephone only, it's a much lower amount, and that all of these benefits officially will go away on April 30th unless they're extended. We do, however, believe that it will be extended. Go ahead, please. How do I keep my business alive during this? Fortunately, Medicare's busy on this. This is obviously the question I get most. Medicare is willing to accelerate and advance payments based upon your past history. All you have to do to qualify is to have Medicare. You have to have billed Medicare within the last 180 days. And I assume that most of the people on this call qualify for that. And you must not be under current investigation. Two things that, in my mind at least, do make quite a bit of sense. If you want to apply for this, and this is different from the PPP loans, it's different from the unemployment benefits and all of that, we're going to use the link that's on the panel. I'm going to give you just a couple of seconds here to take that down in case you want to access those benefits.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris, and we'll make sure that we get that out to people tomorrow too in the Q&A.
Okay. With that, I want to answer the first question that's come up on the chat room, which is, what is your thought on the liability of patients that we do not test and end up very sick later? Is there a possible delay of diagnosis malpractice case? Yes, there is, but this is an extraordinary time. What you have to prove in order to get a malpractice case is that the standard of care that you provided was below the prevailing standard of care at the time the service was or was not provided. What does that mean? It means that while you still could be sued for a delay in diagnosis, unless it was very, very urgent and manifests itself in such a way that anybody would find that out, you're going to be judged less severely than you would during normal times. With that being said, let's go to the next slide. Small business loans. Again, we're on the issue of trying to keep your business alive. As part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act is the acronym, small businesses such as family practices are eligible for loans, some of which are forgivable if you keep employees in the payroll through the crisis. I give you a place where you can go and access that. I give you another app, another place where you can apply for these loans. They are not coming out very quickly, but I know a couple of physicians in the last 48 hours who have gotten those loans. One of the big issues here is keeping your employees. What a lot of people are doing when they realize that their volume was going down is they furloughed employees, they got rid of terminated employees. We'll talk about that in just a second from a contract standpoint. But one of the great things about this loan that to me makes very little sense, it says that they will measure the percentage that is forgiven by taking the number of employees you have in the second quarter of 2020 and dividing that by the number of employees that you had during 2019. What does that mean? That if you get rid of employees, you're not going to get the full benefit of this. But then they did something that to me was incredibly generous. They will say, how many employees do you have at the end of the quarter? So if you've already terminated somebody or furloughed somebody and bring them back, you can get the full benefit of the loan. That's an incredibly generous provision that they made in the CARES Act, and one which those of you who may have furloughed employees should take advantage of. Just make sure you get them back by June 30th. Next slide. Couple of insurance issues that have come up. Managed care companies are processing claims. We've been told, well, there have been questions as to whether managed care companies would be processing claims. They are considered essential employees. It's my understanding that Blue Cross and the other major carriers have not fired claims processors, so you're in good shape there. That being said, make sure that you understand that things may be delayed at least a little bit during this type of period. Make sure that you fully document the medical necessity of every procedure. We are anticipating that a lot of insurance companies will try not to pay for certain services by saying that they were in violation of Executive Order 20-52. You don't want to get yourself into that problem, so make sure you document the medical necessity of everything that you do. Most importantly, though, from an ongoing business perspective, remember, telehealth is being paid at in-person rates by CMS and most insurance companies until at least April 30th. At that point, everyone is going to reevaluate, and we understand why they would do that. We hope that this will continue beyond April 30th. We unfortunately don't believe that it will continue once the state of emergency is lifted. Next slide, please. The question that I'm getting more than probably any other right now is, may I terminate or furlough employees? The short answer is yes, because Florida is an at-will employment state. You can be fired or fire an employee for putting too much peanut butter on their peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You will lose your eligibility for certain forgivable loans, though, if you terminate somebody completely and you don't bring them back by June 30th. So you need to be aware of that. If you are forced to terminate a physician or other member of your staff due to the pandemic, you should let them know that they're entitled to up to $600 per week of federal aid, in addition to what's a pretty minuscule state unemployment benefit. Those benefits are available for up to 4 months. I gave you the link to go there. I'm being told by my sources in Tallahassee that you really want to get the written application right now. The system has been down for days. It is not working well, but the people who are getting the written applications and getting them in, they're getting those written applications into the system very, very quickly. Next slide, please. Before we go to the top 5 questions, one of the questions that I have been getting very frequently is, can I be fired or furloughed if I have a contract? And the answer to that is, being a lawyer, I have to say, it depends on the contract. Generally speaking, a contract defines the relationship of your employment. Therefore, the general rule is, if you have a contract for a base salary, you cannot be fired or terminate or furloughed. It would be a breach of the contract. Now, many employment contracts have a couple of gotchas. One is that you may terminate somebody immediately if there's a government regulation that prevents the doctor from performing their services. For instance, if you were in Duval County and they declared that physicians were not essential services, that would invoke that type of proceeding because you wouldn't be allowed to do your work. Similarly, I know a lot of dermatologists and plastic surgeons who have been fired because they have used that, because you cannot give fillers, you cannot do cosmetic surgery. If that's what you were supposed to do under your contract, then there's an impossibility in the contract. And if you have that type of provision in which a government restriction prevents you from doing your job, then yes, they would be. But assuming you don't have any of that, you can go to your boss and say, I have a contract, you have to honor the contract. And because of the PPP loans, the employer is going to receive a lot of money back on that. Assuming you're making more than 100,000, the employer may not get all of it. Another question that goes to that, when counting employees for payroll protection, do they have to be full-time status? They have to be the same status as what they were in 2019. So if you bring them back on a part-time basis, it doesn't, it's my understanding, they don't count as the same type of employee that they had before. Question, when will all of this end? Right now, or as of 2 days ago, the peak was expected in mid to late April. I still think that's as good of a hunch as we all have, but the economy is not going to reopen for several weeks after that. Talking to other lawyers, talking to legislators and policymakers, we're looking at the end of May before the economy opens up again. We're also going to have to worry that there's almost certainly going to be a double hump. We're going to go through the crisis. We're going through the crisis, and we're hoping that by the end of April, we will have hit the peak. But it's just the way that this virus works. Once we take away the social distancing, once we open up the cosmetic surgery type things, there is going to be a second hump. Now, we're all hoping that people will continue to social distance, that they will come back slowly so that that second hump doesn't break the system. But there will be, and we all need to be ready for that. So I would discourage anybody from opening up their offices in May as if nothing had gone on, and keeping your waiting rooms full, all that kind of stuff. Social distancing is going to be a fact of life for the next several months. What's going to be the new normal? The new normal is going to be that telehealth is going to be normalized. A lot of people did not want to get into telehealth originally because they were worried that it was something new. They didn't have the technology. But you know what? A lot of doctors have now used it, and it's worked. A lot of patients have used it now, and it works. Conjunct to that, in-office traffic is going to be reduced for some time. People are going to want to continue to be social distance. That's good for everybody. They're going to utilize more telemedicine. That also could be good. We'll see how the rates work. And finally, do I have a job when all of this ends? Many employers, as the people in this call probably know, have asked their employees to voluntarily accept reduced hours, furloughs, whatever it may be. And I think that to some extent, even if you have a contract, you need to be in this together with your practice. A lot of places have a termination without cause provision, 60, 90 days. If you make your employer go out of business, they are probably going to invoke that clause and you're going to be out of a job. What I'm trying to do, though, is say, if people get or they're asked to have a furlough, if you're the employee, I want you to ask for a commitment from the employer that you will be back on full-time basis within 15 days of the termination of Florida Executive Order 20-72. The reason I do that, and I truly believe this makes sense, it may take a couple of days to get everything back going, get staff back in. So there may be some days, but you don't want to create an artificial date that may or may not work. If it's May 1st and you have to keep people out longer, you're setting yourself up for another crisis. The governor is going to get this right. At least he's going to get close to it right. So when he lifts that order, that's a good time for people to say, now is the time to make sure that we are fully staffed. Now is the time to make sure we see those patients that we may not have seen during the crisis. Again, social distancing and all those other precautions are really good. Next slide, please. If you have further questions, whether it be on this on this webinar or later, please feel free to send me an email. Email does work best in this day and age. I hope everybody enjoyed this. I want to thank Jay, Adam, all co-presenters, not just tonight, but in previous ones. Folks, we are going to get through this. We are going to save some lives. And I thank you again for everything that you're doing out there.
Thank you very much, Chris. We appreciate that. We've answered some questions during, but looking for any more, you're more than welcome to submit them at this time. You know, we also realize, and you know, your comments, and it's appropriate for tonight, particularly as it relates to Dr. Sanchez Wohlever's presentation. You know, the amount of stress that everyone is under is remarkable, and everyone's tired as well. So, you know, it really is critical, and certainly appreciate the comments that have been made in terms of, you know, just taking that time for yourself. You know, I run an office. I've got only 5 employees. Some of our docs have larger offices, some of them have small, but it really is important to, you know, try to motivate your troops, try to motivate yourself, and take time for yourself, which is why I encourage my staff to get out. And even though we're working remotely, we need to take that time to reflect and just try to recharge our batteries as best as possible. Because if we're burned out, we're no good to the people that we work for, and in particular with you, the patients that you serve. So we thank you, and we've gotten a lot of very positive comments on the kind of chat line, so we do appreciate it. You know, if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate, just reach out to us. As you see on this final slide here, you can reach out to Adam Beamer at his email address there, and we will ask the presenters to answer those questions as they are received, and we will post them with the webinars. All the webinars are posted and archived onto our website. You can get on FAFP.org, and you will see it. It'll be a YouTube link, and we've had a lot of people come in and watch the presentations after the fact, and even ask questions after the fact, which is, you know, that's really why we exist. And so we're happy to help support our members in that regard. As we finish up, you know, what I'll say is that don't forget about next week. We are continuing to do these webinars. I will mention Dr. Chris Kaduri, who is our chair of our COVID task force, is doing a fantastic job of getting these presentations scheduled and getting the presenters the objectives and making sure that they're relevant. So next week we'll be talking about addressing current evidence-based guidelines for COVID-19. The following week we're going to do a kind of a reboot, a telemedicine 2.0 with Dr. Julia Jenkins, Dr. Brady Roberts, and Dr. Nipa Shah, and to talk about the lessons that we've learned since, in terms of now that we've seen, as Chris had mentioned, you know, we've seen some EOBs come in on some of these telemedicine encounters, and maybe some lessons learned there that will help our physicians continue to practice in this new virtual environment like we've talked about. So that's it. I'm trying to see if we've got any other questions. We're just getting nice comments, which we certainly appreciate. As I close, I just want to say thank you, not only for participating, but all you're doing on behalf of your patients. So to our physicians, stay safe, and to everyone else, stay home. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.